So what counts as strong evidence? Mostly we put the word strong on this in order to distinguish it from something like testimony, because while testimony is considered evidence, it's not generally considered strong evidence. In fact, it's generally considered the weakest type of evidence, with hearsay, which is testimony about testimony, being among the weakest. And it frustrates us because strong isn't well defined, and it's potentially subjective. What I consider strong evidence isn't necessarily what Stuart's likely to consider it. But we've settled this issue to some extent about strong or good evidence in courtrooms and in scientific processes. And I can't see why a God, which has been excluded from both of those arenas, could possibly have strong evidence. Science limits itself to naturalistic explanation, so it's not going to make a posit God, and courtrooms don't allow spectral evidence. And yet, if in fact there was a God, if in fact there was a real being that was interacting with reality, it seems that the evidence for this should be found to be admissible both in a courtroom and within science. If the God that we're talking about is somebody that doesn't interact in reality in any detectable or measurable way, then that God's existence is indistinguishable to us from its non-existence. And so hearsay, opinion, feeling, any evidence that could apply to multiple different answers is problematic. If you present an argument for the existence of God, and it is a generic deistic argument or a fuzzy feeling about, hey, we really need some explanation for this, and I can't think of one, but God does it, the question then becomes, is that evidence? Is it strong evidence? And is it strong evidence that points specifically to the God that you believe in, or does it point to a whole myriad group of gods or potential gods that could serve as explanations for things that you're uncomfortable about? In the case of the Bible, we don't have testimonials or depositions. No one is under oath. No one is being questioned. We have propaganda from anonymous, altered, ancient accounts. Eyewitness testimony is unreliable under the best circumstances. And if you recorded like a deposition of someone, what about altered recordings or deep fakes? And we need a chain of custody. There's a difference between here's some evidence and here's some really good evidence that directly links to the proposition that I'm making as a proposed explanation. For me, nothing in the Bible could possibly count as strong evidence. It's a bunch of claims, largely unsupported by evidence, supported by testimonial, anecdotal evidence. It is copies of translations of oral traditions. There's no way to investigate it. It's like a recorded deposition that's garbled from someone 2,000 years ago, and you're never going to be able to investigate it. So what sort of evidence would we expect? I mean, if we're going to get rid of testimonial and say that's not strong evidence, still evidence, not strong, it leaves arguments that attempt to explain these observations, but we need the strong evidence to tie them together. So what sort of evidence could a God provide? Well, I would argue that anything that would qualify as a God could settle this debate right now by showing up, presenting strong evidence, and making a debate. And that this has been true for the entire history of humanity, and that it has never happened. In fact, a version of the argument from Divine Hiddenness suggests that the fact that this hasn't happened strongly suggests that God isn't real and isn't actually able to offer anything. Now, whether or not that means this is what a God can do is a separate issue. As far as I can tell, I haven't suffered so much as a hangnail in punishment for 15 years of railing against every God and every religion that anybody wants to call in about to point out that, hey, there's no good reason to believe this. As far as I can tell, God hasn't done anything. There's a website called Why Won't God Heal Amputees, which I don't know if it's still around or still popular, but it's an interesting question. Now, I've had people tell me that God does in fact heal amputees, and they've seen it with their own eyes, and yet they do not or cannot produce evidence. As a magician, I've heard people describe tricks and watched them claim that the only explanation is that I'm using demonic powers when I know that to be false. I could say, hey, I raised someone from the dead the other day, but they were since abducted by aliens. And if you were with me, you would have seen it. And so that's the strong evidence. Why would I lie? So for ages, we've had people claiming it's rational to believe in a God, and then some claim there's strong evidence. Yet, where's the presentation of the evidence? I don't know, because I wrote this earlier. I don't know what actual evidence Stuart's going to present, but there's lots and lots of claims. I want someone to present the evidence. It needs to be distinctly applicable to the God you're arguing for. It needs to be empirical, examinable, hopefully reproducible. And the God proposition needs to be falsifiable as well. There needs to be some way to show that this isn't true, that in fact it's not. Once upon a time, strong evidence was presented for the sun orbiting the earth, but we were wrong. The sun doesn't orbit the earth. But all of the evidence, and it was good, strong evidence, led us to that conclusion. We also had the same strong evidence that the moon orbits the Earth, and we were right. So strong evidence isn't enough on its own, and we don't even have that. Right now in the United States, we have a prime example. There is no strong evidence of election fraud sufficient to have impacted the 2020 presidential election. Despite this fact, multiple recounts, elections being the most secure ever, every state has certified the results. The Supreme Court has rejected an attempt by Texas and 18 other states in this area, and now electors have cast their votes. There isn't strong evidence of fraud that would have impacted the election. There's not even weak evidence, yet people still believe it's a fraudulent election, just like they believe the Earth is flat, just like they believe there's a God. The only difference between evidence for fraud and evidence for God is that the fraud proposition is actually testable and falsifiable, while the God proposition isn't, which for clarity makes it the weaker claim with the weaker evidence, not stronger. The fraud proposition is something natural that's known to be a potential explanation for election results. The God claim isn't known to be a potential explanation for anything. If we're trying to explain something, whether it's election fraud, the existence of the universe, hope, morality, what created something, is there something rather than nothing that we have to explain, we begin by listing candidate explanations, things that we know from experience and evidence could be a potential explanation. God did it as a claim, has never been demonstrated to even qualify as a candidate explanation. We stopped allowing spectral evidences in courts. Try walking into a courtroom and suggesting that God told you to break the speed limit or that he told you to bomb an abortion clinic. The courts will not accept that. But if there were strong evidence for God, the courts would have to accept it. This issue is as over and done as the 2020 election. It's just that they're going to be an increasingly diminishing portion of the population that, like Trump and his supporters, simply refuse to concede.